here today with David West from Hill West Architects. David, pleasure to have you.
Nice to be here, Sisto.
It's been a long time. We haven't seen each other in a while, but always a great day when we get to talk about zoning in New York City.
Yes, my favorite subject.
And David is a well-respected zoning architect here in New York City. He's done it a long time, like myself. So we have him in here today to come and talk to us a little bit about what the mayor and the city planning is proposing for our city over the next several years. David's going to touch on a couple of topics today, but the first topic, as always, we're going to cover is the topic that we all talk about, that we've worked together, which is the 421A. So if we could spend a few minutes on that, David, our industry, the expediting, code consulting, zoning, has gotten soft because a lot of our developers have left New York City. They don't have the incentives to build market rate and affordable that's feasible. So we've had other guests come in and talk to us about what they're hearing. So I'd like to start with that, and then we can get into the tech stuff. So tell me a little bit about the buzz you're hearing, if any.
Well, I'd like to say I'm hearing something good, but I actually haven't. It seems like there's radio silence on 421A. We had high hopes 6 months ago. There were lots of good proposals on the table, including a new 421A and also an extension of the current 421A to
Take it out to
enable
like 2025
projects that vested to get completed. None of that got done. It's all being held hostage, I assume, to some other types of legislation that are less appealing to the development community. The good cause eviction being the main one, I think. I would assume that at some point it will, in fact, get reenacted, but I don't know when. Maybe not. It's not happening this year, apparently.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I heard the same radio silence. From the experts that I spoke to, at the state level. I spoke to some people there, and they say that it's floating about. But again, a lot of the contractors and developers that we're working with, they're very nervous because a lot of our 421A projects are just starting right now, and they need to be done.
Yeah, we've had at least one major project that was vested and in design stop.
Yeah.
And I imagine there are going to be others. I should say more than one. I can think of more than one.
Us too.
Yeah, it's had a huge impact on our industry. Over the last 4 or 5 years, we've been building thousands of units of housing, mostly in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens, and all of them taking advantage of 421A and, of course, providing a good deal of affordable housing through the process. Now all we have are the projects that got vested a year ago.
Same for us.
They're on the board still, some of them. They're in the ground, some of them. I think most of them will make the deadline of 2026, barring unforeseen circumstances, but there are often unforeseen circumstances.
Sure. Well, a lot of our sites that we have, I think at the time that we made our filings, that not all of the jobs that got vested actually started. Two of our one project we're on together started immediately, and the other half of that project, that particular developer owned the site somewhere else. They just started excavation a few weeks ago. That's a year later after being vested, and I think finances has something to do with it. Fear of the market at times has something to do with it, and I think that without this reassurance of that they can keep the pipeline. You and I spoke before we got on air today about, so what's the pipeline look like for your firm, for my firm? It's not very good without a 421A because that's been our niche. That's what we do.
Well, it's been dramatic, honestly. There are no new rental projects coming in, whereas 18 months or 2 years ago, we probably had 10 large projects starting up at that time. Now we have like one. And that's somebody rolling the dice, hoping something will take the place of 421A. The problem is there's been a version of 421A in the city for, 30 years?
Right. All of a sudden, you pull the rug out.
It's baked into all the economic equations.
Agreed.
And without it, there's an imbalance, and that the projects don't make sense. The good news for us, anyway, as a firm, is that there has been a pickup in the condo market,
Right.
but it's a very different type of work. These
Different,
are
and same thing.
small
We're in
jobs. They're high end. They're in Manhattan primarily. Different group of developers doing them. So we're lucky that some of that work has come in and it's taken up the slack
when you-
for
when you-
us. But it's not the same thing as producing 1,000-unit jobs.
right. I mean, but your firm is fortunate enough that you have quality designers and quality people that you can go from that market to another market, because the condo market is, for us too, it is a much different type of in terms of service, in terms of design, in terms of it's different. It's got a whole different perspective to it. It's got a different feel to it. And staying on that for a minute before we get into what I know you really want to dive into, which is your expertise of the zoning text, is part of the show is we talk about what's going on in New York City, right? And one of the things that was a big splash at the beginning of the year, and it's really quieted down, to be honest with you, from where we're seeing it, was the office to residential conversion. And it's special to me because, I worked on those type of buildings on a small scale 25, 30 years ago here in Brooklyn, where there were manufacturing buildings and we converted them to loft buildings. And it was really exciting. They were great apartments. They had a great feel to them. And the city has been promoting, Midtown zoning, about how they have from 59th Street down, the zoning is going to allow certain things to happen for office to residential. What is a firm like Hill West seeing? Is that opportunity as big as we say it is? Because for us, we've bid a few of them. It's not like when the 421A comes out, we get 10, 15 RFPs in a few month period. We've gotten 2 over 9 months.
Yeah, I would say we sort of see the same thing. It's not a huge pipeline of work, but I think that's partly because these projects are very difficult in many cases to do, and there aren't that many candidate buildings that are free
Available.
and clear of tenants, and where there's financing available to do a project like that. But the underlying fact is these landlords, the commercial landlords, are in severe distress.
Oh, they're in trouble.
And in
No doubt.
places like Lower Manhattan, there are buildings that are mostly vacant, or entirely vacant, I think, in a few cases. And so it does make sense. It makes sense on a lot of levels. It makes sense because a lot of these buildings are much bigger than you would be allowed to build a
Sure, the
residential
FAR is
building
higher.
on the same site. And as long as you can hold on to all that FAR and convert it, it's a great proposition.
The biggest issue that I've spoke about, because I've interviewed a few people about it. We had Lou Madigan on. He's doing a site in Midtown, about 80,000 square feet or 77,000 square feet, and where the expedited code consultant's on it. And we're struggling with the multiple dwelling law because the building's big. We got to create light and air. The law hasn't been changed in a very long time. And now when we look at other sites, because we're first in and we're doing it, I even spoke to, Richard Lobel from Sheldon's office, and Richard was saying the same thing, that, there are proposals supposedly in to start to change the multiple dwelling law, the article, for the loft conversion. And if that happens, I think that will help make that decision easier for developers, because I think that the zoning is not the difficult part because it's vested already, most of it, the bulk. The problem is trying to get the light and air and making the apartments work. The building sizes aren't right for commercial. They're 100 by 100 buildings, and they just don't fit the layout.
Yeah, well, sure. Most of the conversions we've done over the years have used Article 1, Chapter 5 of the zoning, which is imperfect at best, but it's very helpful for particularly the light and air aspect of it, and also just the notion that you can convert over the basic permitted FAR in a given district, and in many cases over
David,
12. You have to change the state multiple dwelling law to open up a larger pool of buildings to be able to do that.
Isn't the Article 1, Chapter 5 really more from like 59th Street and down? Does it
Well,
really
yeah,
go?
the
It doesn't
problem with
really
it
go to the other
is
boroughs.
it's only a very limited pool of buildings
Right.
right now that qualify for it, and the biggest hurdle I think is that in most of Manhattan it only applies to buildings built before 1961, with the exception of Lower Manhattan where it applies to buildings built before 77. But a lot of these buildings that are in trouble
Right. They
date
were
from
built
the
in the
80s,
80s.
the
Right. I was
90s.
just going to say.
So the proposals are all there, I think, at both the city and the state level. The people have identified what needs to be changed, but the will hasn't been sufficient
And
enough
have you
yet.
heard anything from city planning about how they want to try to use that same article throughout the boroughs, not just
Yes.
this? So tell
And
us a little bit about that.
well, there's, this suite of zoning proposals called City of Yes,
Yep.
and it's broken into three pieces. The first piece is in ULURP right now, which is the carbon neutrality, which I'd like to talk a little more about.
Absolutely.
The second piece is called economic
Right.
opportunity, and the third one is housing opportunity. And that's not supposed to be released until next year.
The
We
housing.
haven't seen any text for housing opportunity, but I think that's where the conversion provisions are, and also some other good things, like we've heard about a potential for increased FAR for
Correct.
affordable housing in mixed income projects that they call top up, which would allow buildings to be built to the size that's permitted right now for heirs buildings, but for any mixed income building that met certain criteria. But that only
So that's
works.
a big change.
That only works with 421A.
Correct. Same thing.
Because you're getting a
Without
bonus to build affordable. If you can use the same affordable to satisfy the 421A requirement,
they
it
work
makes
together.
sense, and it's going to generate a lot of buildings. But they do need to enact a new 421A for that to work. So
Right.
we're
So they have to
hopeful.
go together.
They have to go together.
So tell us a little about this carbon neutrality.
Well, the zoning for carbon neutrality text came out. They released the text about a month ago or 6 weeks ago. It's been developed by city planning with Urban Green Council as a big driver of the actual
Makes sense.
technical details, and they had several stakeholder meetings with people in the industry to try and get it right. It contains some really good provisions, and I think it's all positive. The big ones from my point of view as a building designer are a new version of what we call Zone Green. They're calling it Zone Greener, I think.
Greener. The grass is greener on the other side.
And that one has a big effect because most of the developers have gotten comfortable with the version of Zone Green that's on the books today, which was enacted in 2012, where we build an over-insulated building and we get to deduct some of the wall thickness for it. And that's become almost standard,
Right.
especially in larger projects. Instead of that, they're now planning, they call that a prescriptive standard. They're going to replace it with a performance-based standard, and it'll be a little more like Passive House, but without the certification. It's going to require an energy use index for a
Right, I was gonna
building
say,
that's
so how are they going to
quite
monitor it?
stringent, and also that the buildings be all electric, which is coming anyway because of city laws.
Right.
I think it's a good thing. And then instead of a wall thickness deduction, it's going to be a flat 5% floor area
So
deduction.
you're not going to have to do the full
So-
calculation. You just get 5%.
You don't have to look at the physical
Correct.
thickness of the
The
walls,
walls, you
which
just-
frankly that's become a cumbersome
Oh,
thing
God,
to
yeah.
do, and we're building buildings that
Well, it's
don't.
cumbersome for us because when we submit
always
those
make
energy
sense.
calculations, the examiner's going back instead of looking at 5% of the total wall, they're looking at each little piece and, have to do these calculations, and they got to verify what your team is putting on those drawings. It's cumbersome.
So I think it's a good thing, and it will encourage a higher standard of construction. I think they have to get it right in terms of what energy use index they select, and there needs to be some kind of a phase-in because there are a lot of projects currently in
That was going to be
design
my next question.
that have assumed they're going to get zone green under the current rules. If the new text gets approved in October, as is now possible,
What do you do with the buildings that are in construction?
what would you do with buildings already designed under the old rules? So zoning has a vesting provision, which is completion of
The foundation?
foundations.
Correct.
That isn't necessarily workable for these buildings, particularly the ones, by the way, that are in the 421A cycle vested under the current 421A program. They have until June of 2026 to complete. A lot of them are just going in the ground right now,
Right.
as we discussed a few minutes
Right.
ago. So
How do
those
they, if they have to change their facade, if they have to change things, now they're already in design, you'd have to redesign everything and start all over. You could lose months.
It would be a big problem. But the fact is that I think when they wrote the text, maybe they hadn't thought that through, but enough people now have commented on this that I believe there will be
So, David, let me ask you a question.
vesting
I love
provision.
to hear about these changes and these texts. Tell me a little bit. Were you involved in being part of some of these changes? Like, what was your personal experience in helping, because you've done zoning in this city for a long time. I don't want to give your age away, but, like me, 37 years I've been in this business. And, being in this business allows us to appreciate a lot of things. One of my mentors always was Sheldon Lobel. I would call him with all my zoning questions. And he was a man that always took time. And he would always talk about the people that make the changes, and he would always acknowledge those people. And to me, I look to you as one of those people who have helped shape this city in whatever, whether it's through your designs, whether it's through your passion for zoning, if it's your, probably when you were younger, you fought the city on certain concepts, and now you're there still fighting for what I'm sure you. So tell me a little bit. Are you like on some of these committees to help these new laws?
Well, I'm the main venue I have to effectuate things is through the real estate board. They have a zoning and design committee.
True,
It
Rep.
includes some engineers and architects as well as a lot of land use lawyers. And they have a pretty good voice with the city.
Yeah.
What the city does when they can, and it's not every initiative they have, but all the big zoning initiatives
out
they've
to
done
the-
over the years is they tend to assemble coalitions of practitioners from various aspects
So
of the
that's where
industry.
your voice is really heard
And
through the real estate
For
board.
instance, on zoning for carbon neutrality, there have been a series of stakeholder meetings that the city has held through Urban Green Council has been, I think, the sponsor for those meetings.
Right, you had mentioned that before. Yeah, that's great.
And they have members from the sustainability community, engineers, architects, developers, planners.
So
all
collectively, everyone puts in their
having
ideas.
an opportunity to comment on things as they come up and
That's awesome.
see through some of the changes. And look, it's an imperfect system, but it works pretty well. The same thing happened at least a few times over the years that I can think of. For example, when they did ZQA, there was a big outreach. City planning did a lot of outreach, and there were a lot of voices that helped to
And you need
shape
the
that
voice of the
text.
people. You need the voice of the customer.
Key terms, text amendment was another one. So
Yeah.
I've been lucky enough to participate
That's
in a
awesome.
number of these over the years, and I can point to quite a few things in the zoning resolution
Say,
that
hey, I remember being part of
I
that.
fixed, and I could point to some things that maybe aren't in the zoning resolution.
And the beauty about zoning to me is that, I never really dabbled in it deeply. It was never really something that I enjoyed because to me, it always took a certain mindset that you could read the same text over and over and you can get a different result every time you read it. And what I loved about zoning was that if I read it, that I could reach out to you or I could reach out to Sheldon or I could reach out to someone and they would give me their side of it. And it would open my mind up that I felt like I was in this box all the time, and that when I reached out to you on a project that we did in Long Island City, we would talk about quality housing, or we would talk about how the building department interpreted, how city planning, put it out there. and yet what it really ended up being a year later. What the text said, what the DOB interpreted, and what, as architects and as code consultants, we came to the conclusion of what they really wanted. And that's what makes it so challenging,
Yeah,
that
well,
although it's as of right, you would think, oh, it's as of right. You just go to the book, you look at the diagram, and you put it in there. Well, no, unfortunately, that's not the way it works. So tell me a little bit about, how we all are in the industry together, and we rely on each other to give a different perspective of what we read and what we see.
well, yeah, I'm not quite sure I got the whole question there, but
The question meaning that, we look at something sometimes and we say, oh, this says in this district you could do this, you could do that. And then you keep reading, and then it sends you somewhere else, and then it sends you somewhere else. And then you, as that zoning designer, as the zoning guru at Hill West, you have to try to make sure that you've checked all of those pieces and they all fit together in the puzzle, even though sometimes it seems like, and we've found places where they've made mistakes and we'd have to call zoning. No, no, we meant that for that block too. It's just shown incorrectly on the little
Yeah.
map. Well, that's pretty scary.
well, there's this sort of nebulous thing called the intent,
The intent,
right?
correct.
And who knows what the intent is sometimes, but city planning thinks they know what the intent is, and that's usually what the lawyers rely on to be the final arbiter of an interpretation. And the building department, I think, is
And I
always
think the building
talking
department does a
to
pretty
city
good job
planning.
with it. I really do.
But look, I think the problem is it's hard to write a set of rules that govern all buildings developed in a city like New York City
Very complicated.
over what now is, 40, 50 years.
Right.
It's been really remarkably successful,
Oh,
in my opinion.
incredible.
And I am a huge proponent of the as of right path of zoning.
We're on the same page there.
80 to 90% of the buildings we do are as of right. They don't have to go through design reviews by community boards. The things that do are the ULURPs, of
Right.
course. And then
But,
there's
but
all
if you
kinds
get
of-
outside the city, you have to go to town
most
meetings. And
places have project-specific approvals outside of New York City, meaning the individual building.
Correct.
There may be zoning in place, but it doesn't always tell you what you can build or what you can't.
correct. They give you the side yards, they give you the square footage, but they don't really tell you what you can build.
And, the super tall buildings are as of right. You
Yes.
would never get a building like that
Anywhere.
approved to be built if it had to go through a project-specific review. So I think it's beautiful, and it's led to huge amounts of housing construction that wouldn't have happened otherwise,
Agreed.
and all types of construction. I'm sure people would argue the opposite, that you get unintended consequences, but
No
if-
system's perfect.
if the goal is to enable the city to grow in a meaningful way, it's been a fantastic regime. And you have to give city planning a lot of credit. I
No
think
doubt.
it's one of the most professional city planning departments in the world, I believe. And they're
Wow.
very proactive. They are always looking at it, trying to make it better. As a result, they often are making it much more complicated.
Of course,
Um,
but part of it, as we discussed off the air, is that I think that our city thrives because there are great agencies like city planning that protect us, to protect the developer, they protect the city, they protect the people that live in the buildings. They allow the laws to be part of the fabric of our city, and it's not the Wild West. It's a place where these laws help architects, developers, and give a great quality of life to the people that live here. So for me, I always appreciate what a difficult job they have to meet all of these things that people need in our city, especially in the housing. And not only housing, but how about, warehousing? How about all of the other things that they have to think about, supermarkets and retail, and it's not just housing, it's not just office buildings, it's everything. And they balance all of that to try to keep it harmonious, keep it flowing.
It's as close as we have in the city to a comprehensive city master plan.
Yeah.
A lot of people say that that's a lacking thing in this city, that there isn't comprehensive planning.
I
there's
disagree
not
with that.
citywide needs assessments and so on. But there is. It just manifests itself a little
Takes time.
differently than there being one big report that said this is what has to happen in
Right,
the
and,
city.
and I think it's organic. It takes time. You don't just put up buildings. I've been here in Greenpoint, Williamsburg now for 30 years, and when they rezoned it, you know, we would have never imagined that now, almost, 18 years later, 15 years later, that it's a metropolis. I mean, it is, and
It
and
is
and it took
unbelievable.
time for supermarkets to make their way here. It took time for the retailers to get here. All the apartment houses went up. All the market rate and affordable, buildings went up. All the 421A buildings went up quick, but it took time for them to develop into neighborhoods. But city planning had that vision. They understood what else was needed besides apartments. And I think, for me, that's the proof in the pudding that if you're in this industry long enough, as you and I said earlier, we get to see it. We get to see, if you're here, you can't project it out 30 years. But when you were here 30 years ago and now you get to see it, you say, wow, they did a really good job with that.
Well, I'll tell you, that's an interesting one that you bring up. When that zoning was written, which was probably 2001 or two,
Yeah.
somewhere around there, what city planning did was they engaged with many stakeholders, including property owners that owned the parcels along the waterfront of Greenpoint and Williamsburg. And each one, maybe not each one, but many of them engaged architects and planners to work with the city at that time and help develop appropriate zoning densities and envelopes and zoning controls. And I was involved with one developer at that time, and there was a meaningful engagement with the city. So I think they don't do their work in a vacuum. They're pretty good at reaching out
Well,
and
and
trying
I
to.
think a lot of people don't know that city planning does exactly, and that's what I love about this
Well, they
podcast, David.
probably try to keep it under the radar to some extent, but it's not just they're not just engaging with the development community; they're engaging
With everyone.
with other constituencies as well.
Right, and what I think to me is that's why I love doing the podcast is that when people like you come in, we get the viewership gets to see that other part that they probably like. Well, does city planning just do this on their own? Who decides this? There's so many people that come that are part of this decision making. It's not just city planning. Like you said, it's the owners of the people of the waterfront. It's the architects that are working with the community or with the developers. It's the constituents in that community board. There's so much that goes into changing zoning and the text because it's got a big impact. I mean, you just walk down the street in Williamsburg, you could see it.
So we did veer off topic a little bit.
Yeah,
I
go
was
back to
talking
carbon
about
neutrality.
carbon neutrality. I'm going to give it a little plug.
Yeah, of
because I
course.
think
No,
it's
go
a
ahead. My
good thing.
apologies.
The big goal, of course, is to make our city more carbon neutral,
Of
which
course.
is a goal I think most people share these days.
Absolutely.
The things in it that are going to help us with that, a big one for practitioners is the rooftop permitted obstructions allowances. They're
Correct.
going
That's
to
a
be
big change.
liberalized. What we found, and we've been doing electric HVAC systems now for, 10 years
Yeah.
maybe. The VRF systems
Sure.
have started to become standard. The problem with them is they need the equipment spread out over
a
a
roof.
wide roof area with
Right.
lots of free air around it. It's not like a cooling tower or
Right.
a chiller
Which-
plant, which is in one little box. It wants to be spread out. So the 20% lot coverage, which has been the standard for mechanical on a roof above a height limit, is being liberalized. And the proposal on the table is 50%.
Wow.
But within that 50%, only 30% can exceed a height of 15 feet. So
Okay.
the reason for the two-step
Well,
approach is
if
that
if you want to go to all electric, you're going to need a place to put the equipment.
Well,
So
yeah.
you're going to have to.
you still need tall things, which are
Right.
elevator machine rooms,
Sure.
cooling towers. Some buildings still have them, et cetera. Those can go up
That's a pretty
right
that's
now to 40 feet, and under the
20%
proposal,
to 50% is a pretty big number. That's
it's
a big jump.
It's a big jump.
Big
But
jump.
most of that's for things 15
than
feet
feet.
and less
Okay.
In height. And there are lower limits for the lower density zones.
And what other
but,
highlights do they have? So we
Well,
talked
we
about the
talked about the
5%,
zone green. There's
right?
going to also be a new version of the exterior wall deduction that is like zone green, but it's only for existing buildings that
Oh, okay.
overclad and go all electric. If they meet a certain standard, they'll get a wall thickness deduction. I believe that's how it works, up to
That makes
12
sense.
inches thick, which is an increase over what's currently in the books for 8 inches. So, and I think they have a mechanism to allow what they call reclads as opposed to overclads, where the exterior plane of the wall is held as is, but they can increase the thickness into the building and get a zoning
Oh,
bonus for that as well. So that's bringing it in line more with what
so
people
so
actually have to do. If
so
you take
one
an office building and you replace the skin and you put a highly insulated skin on it, you're going to be allowed to do that um, without penalty, whether the skin goes out past the existing building
as a
line or
permitted
whether it
obstruction
comes
or
in.
whether
I
it comes
think
in.
they're going to treat each of those the same
So,
way.
so when you look at this, you know, the $1 million question always is how are building owners going to feel at the end of the day with the bonuses that they're getting and the investment that they're making? Do you feel that it's very fair? Do you think it's, you know, because a lot of times, you know, I'm not a negative person, but a lot of times when we hear about, you know, uh, energy efficient things, that sometimes it costs so much to get a little bit back. Here, it sounds like this plan seems to be something where it's got some incentive that it's feasible for people to jump in and buy in.
Oh, look, I think a lot of these are things people are doing anyway to some extent. We did our first market rate passive house building just recently. It's
Oh,
just getting
congratulations.
finished up. The Gemma Gramercy on West 23rd Street. SMA Equities was the developer.
Awesome.
And affordable projects have been doing passive house for a while. There are a lot of affordable passive house projects. There are city mandates for it. They're going for special funding and the NYSERDA Building of Excellence Awards, et cetera. So that
So
industry
that's in the works.
has already taken root in New York City. The new zoning is essentially enabling and accommodating people to do things that they want to do anyway. Otherwise, it doesn't work, right? You can't incentivize somebody to do something that
Correct.
doesn't make any sense
Well, because I
from
think
a
that
market
sometimes when the
perspective.
city does these new laws and they basically say either you do it or you're going to get fined. You know, sometimes I think that really doesn't.
Yeah.
It's tough to get the owners to buy in because they feel like they're being forced to do it. Where it sounds like this carbon neutrality, it allows you to look at these things and find the benefit in it, and you're getting things back for it.
Well, look, not to gloss over it, but there are a lot of things people are being forced into doing.
Of course,
Most of that's coming from the city council and local
sure,
laws, but we're going to be all electric by 2027 with
correct,
taller buildings, no fossil fuel hookups,
correct.
difficult to achieve. But at least with the new zoning, there will be
And
some incentive for it.
well, David, it's been a pleasure. I'm glad that you came down. We haven't seen each other in a while. We work together on many great buildings. Your firm does incredible work here in the New York City area as well as New Jersey and other parts of the country. Um, it's always a pleasure for me to sit down with someone who knows zoning like you. It's truly a pleasure for the audience to know what's going on. And the best part about having a podcast is that we get to talk about it today. And as one of my guests once said, we never look in the rearview mirror, we're always looking forward. So, looking forward in zoning, I get to have you come back in a year from now and say, hey, you know what, David, we talked about all these things. How's the carbon neutrality working out? How's the yes to the housing? How's the yes to business, economic? And how are all these ideas that city planning's putting into place? So, looking forward to having you back. And thank you for coming in.
Well, thanks, Sisto, and I think this is a great forum for people in the industry to
I'm look.
talk shop. It's a nice opportunity.
I appreciate it. Thank you.